The rain had been relentless that afternoon, the sort that wrapped the English countryside in a silver veil, while carriages rolled heavily through the mud. Within the grand estate of Ravenshire Hall, however, not a single window dared allow the storm inside. The chandeliers glowed with golden resilience, the parquet floor had been polished to a mirror-like gleam, and the musicians in the gallery rehearsed soft waltzes that drifted through the corridors like forgotten memories. It was in this setting, luxurious, immaculate, unbearably still, that the Marquis of Ravenshire stood before the tall windows of his study, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the grey horizon, as if the storm itself owed him an explanation. Lord Adrian Ashcombe had the kind of presence that compelled attention without ever seeking it. Tall, impeccably dressed even in solitude, with the austere bearing of a man raised to command, he carried the reputation of being both unshakably composed and impossibly distant. Servants spoke of him in lowered voices, guests at balls admired him from afar, mothers whispered his name to daughters as if he were a myth. And yet, to those who truly knew him, if such people existed, he was a man defined more by absence than presence. Absent warmth, absent vulnerability, absent the ability or perhaps the willingness to love with the openness expected of a husband. On the desk behind him lay unopened correspondence, invitations to soirees he would never attend, and a single letter written in a delicate feminine hand he had long ago ceased to recognize at a glance. It was from his wife, Lady Eleanor Ashcombe, whom he had married 7 years earlier, not out of affection, but obligation. At least, that was what he had convinced himself at the time. She had come from a respectable family, had impeccable manners, and possessed a quiet beauty he had found inconvenient rather than comforting. Her voice had always been soft, her presence gentle, her hopes unspoken yet transparent enough for him to avoid. He had told himself that she desired too much, that she felt too deeply, that she expected things from marriage he had no intention of giving, and so he had retreated into work, into society, into solitude, until she became a shadow moving silently through the halls, a woman married to him in name, but invisible in truth. He had not intended to ignore her. Indifference, after all, was not an act, but a condition. But over the years, it had grown roots in him, a habit so comfortable he mistook it for necessity. When she entered a room, he acknowledged her with polite courtesy, nothing more. When she spoke at dinner, he responded with vague murmurs, his thoughts elsewhere. And when she tried, God, she had tried, to reach him with letters, glances, questions, invitations to walk with her in the gardens, he answered with silence, so refined it felt like elegance. Tonight, however, something in the air unsettled him, as if the storm outside had seeped through the walls and threaded itself into his spine. The household was unnaturally active. Flowers were being arranged in the ballroom. Footmen hurried with silver trays. A seamstress adjusted the drapes in the corridor, and the musicians rehearsed with unusual dedication. There was an energy he could not identify, a tremor of anticipation that brushed against him like a whisper he was not meant to hear. He turned from the window just as the study door opened, revealing his steward, Mr. Hensley, an older man who had served the Ashcombe family for decades. "My lord," Hensley said with a hesitant inclination of the head, "Lady Ashcombe wishes to know if you intend to attend the gathering this evening." "The gathering?" he asked, though he knew his wife had been preparing something for weeks, something she had mentioned twice and he had dismissed both times with a courteous nod meant to close the subject. "Is it tonight?" "It is, my lord," Hensley replied, carefully. "Lady Ashcombe has invited several families from the surrounding counties. It is to be a rather elegant affair." Adrian exhaled slowly, irritation touching his expression for the briefest moment. "I have business that requires my attention." Hensley bowed. "Very well, my lord, I shall inform her." But as the steward turned, something in Adrian's chest tightened unexpectedly. Not guilt, not concern, but a faint, peculiar discomfort he could not name. He dismissed it at once. Feelings, in his experience, were unreliable companions. Still, when the evening unfolded and he remained in his study, trying to occupy himself with correspondence, he had no intention of reading. The muffled sounds of music and laughter drifting up from the ballroom began to intrude like a persistent memory. He could imagine the chandeliers glowing, the guests admiring the newly arranged flowers, the warmth of conversation tightening around the edges of his solitude, and in the center of it all, Eleanor, his wife, moving with her quiet grace, greeting guests, managing every detail with the calm competency he had always taken for granted. He had not seen her properly in days. She had become a distant presence, felt but rarely observed, and he had allowed it. What else was marriage if not a quiet arrangement between two lives that rarely touched? But then, just as he picked up a fountain pen to pretend he had work to do, something shifted. It began as a faint tremor of applause from the ballroom, then a ripple of murmured admiration, and then, God help him, a sound that reached him not through the walls but through his bones, her voice, her laughter. He froze. He had not heard her laugh in months, perhaps years. It was not the soft, tentative sound he remembered from their early days of marriage. It was richer now, warmer, touched with a confidence that startled him. He found himself standing before he had made a conscious decision to rise. Something tugged at him, an instinctive pull he resented for its familiarity. Without quite knowing why, he stepped out of his study and into the corridor. The music grew clearer, voices carried, and among them, a deeper one, masculine, unfamiliar. He descended the grand staircase slowly, each step deliberate. He told himself he was simply curious, that he was merely observing, that he had every right to ensure propriety was being upheld within his home. Yet when he reached the lower landing, he saw her, Eleanor. She stood near the center of the ballroom, illuminated by the glow of the chandeliers. She wore a gown of pale blue silk that made her appear almost celestial, the gentle curve of her neck adorned with a simple string of pearls, her hair styled in an elegant chignon threaded with silver pins. But it was not her beauty that arrested him. It was her expression. She was smiling, truly smiling, her eyes alight with warmth as she spoke with a tall gentleman in a dark suit, a man Adrian was certain he had never seen before. The gentleman leaned slightly toward her, speaking with the ease of someone entirely at home in conversation. And Eleanor, his quiet, reserved, dutiful wife, responded with a soft laugh that stole the air from Adrian's lungs. A strange, unwelcome sensation crawled beneath his skin. He watched her closely, not as a husband, but as a man suddenly aware of how little he knew the woman he had married. She looked different, lively, present, alive in a way he had never witnessed in their own interactions. He told himself it meant nothing, but then it happened. The gentleman bowed his head slightly at something she said, and she, smiling still, responded with a phrase that, though spoken lightly, cut through the room like a blade made for him alone. "My lord," she said to the other man, not to Adrian, to him. Adrian's breath left him in a sharp, silent exhale. The words were harmless in any other context, a polite form of address, a mere courtesy. Yet coming from her lips, directed to another man beneath his own roof, they pierced him with a force he could not have anticipated. For the first time in years, the Marquess of Ravenshire felt something other than controlled indifference. It was not anger, not jealousy, not yet. It was something deeper, more primal, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. A realization, cold and startling, that she could speak to another man with warmth she had never offered him, because he had never allowed her to offer it. He clenched, his jaw. His hands tightened at his sides, his chest constricted in a way that felt perilously close to vulnerability. He had ignored his wife for years. He had treated her affection as an inconvenience, her presence as a formality, her heart as something too fragile to bother with. And now she called another man, my lord. A simple courtesy, yes, but to him, it felt like a warning, or perhaps a consequence. As he stood there, half hidden in the shadow of the staircase, the truth struck him with quiet brutality. For the first time since their wedding day, he realized he might actually lose her, and the cruelest part, he had never understood she mattered to him until that very moment. The night should have continued without his interference. That was what Adrian told himself as he stood at the foot of the staircase, half hidden in shadows, while the ballroom glowed with life he had not contributed to. He could have turned back. He could have retreated to his study, to his solitude. to the familiar numbness that had shielded him from the world for years. But something had shifted the moment he heard her call another man, "my lord." Something old and unwelcome that rose from a place he had spent most of his adult life burying. He felt it in the tightening of his throat, the unease settling in his stomach, the sharp clarity with which he suddenly saw the distance he himself had created between them. He stepped further into the ballroom, though he did not immediately approach her. Instead, he positioned himself near a column, allowing the soft candlelight to graze only the edge of his coat. He watched Eleanor with a scrutiny that unsettled even him, noticing every detail he had ignored for years. The poised manner in which she tilted her head when listening, the calm way she folded her hands at her waist, the subtle glow on her cheeks that suggested genuine enjoyment. She seemed liberated, lighter, as though she had shed the invisible weight he had placed on her, since the day he shut the doors of his heart and expected her to simply accept it. The gentleman beside her, dark-haired, well-mannered, unfamiliar, leaned closer as she spoke. Adrian's jaw tightened, though he forced his expression to remain unreadable. There was no reason for concern, he told himself. A husband observing his wife was not suspicious, it was merely proper. And yet propriety had nothing to do with the cold flicker of something perilously close to jealousy that moved through his veins. He turned away before his thoughts betrayed him, stepping into the quieter corridor beyond the ballroom. The moment the music softened behind the doors, he felt the tension in his chest resurface, heavily, insistently. He disliked the sensation. Emotional reaction had never served him well. In fact, it had been a weakness stamped out of him in childhood. He made his way toward the old gallery, the one place in the estate where he could walk without encountering footmen or portraits of ancestors staring disapprovingly at him. The lamps along the walls cast elongated shadows that swayed with the flame, and his footsteps echoed against the marble floor with a measured rhythm. Here, away from curious eyes, it became easier to recall memories he had spent years avoiding. He had not always been a man so guarded. There had been a time, before his title, before the crushing expectations, before he learned what it meant to lose people, that he had felt things more openly. He had cared. He had trusted, perhaps too deeply. He remembered being 18 when his father fell ill, the illness that lingered for months before taking him in early winter. The loss had been sudden and yet slow, a cruel contradiction that left Adrian feeling responsible for filling the void long before he was ready. With his father's death came the title, the estates, the obligations, and a pressure that seemed to swallow his youth whole. But that had not been the wound that shaped him. No, his true unraveling began 2 years later, when he allowed himself to care for someone he believed he could build a future with. A young woman named Charlotte Fairburn, gentle, affectionate, everything he thought he needed in order to endure the burden of his new responsibilities. She had smiled at him with sincere devotion, spoken of hope and companionship, made promises of loyalty. He had believed all of it. And then, one evening in London, he found her in the conservatory of her aunt's townhouse, laughing, radiant, leaning too close to another man whose hand rested at the small of her back with a familiarity that destroyed any notion of innocence. He had confronted her. She had cried. She had claimed confusion, weakness, temporary foolishness. But betrayal, especially the first betrayal of a young, unarmored heart, did not allow room for explanations. Something inside him had closed that night so tightly that he had never managed to pry it open again. He ended the courtship. Within the hour, returned to Ravenshire Hall with the stoicism of a man twice his age, and vowed quietly, bitterly, that he would never again allow his emotions to compromise his dignity. It was from that vow that the man he became had been forged, reserved, controlled, untouched by sentiment. Marriage, when it eventually came, had been nothing more than a practical arrangement, a duty to the lineage. Eleanor had entered his life like a final obligation, someone pleasant enough, graceful enough, agreeable enough to serve the role of Marchioness without requiring anything from him he did not wish to give. He had chosen her precisely because she felt safe, because she did not stir any of the vulnerable places he had buried beneath years of discipline, or so he believed. Adrian exhaled sharply as he reached the end of the gallery, stopping beside the tall window that overlooked the rain-soaked terrace. His reflection stared back at him faintly in the glass, composed, aristocratic, emotionless, yet he could feel the turbulence beneath the surface like a storm gathering in the distance. He pressed a hand against the windowsill, grounding himself. Why had those simple words pierced him? Why had hearing her address another man with warmth unsettled him so profoundly? He knew the answer, though he was reluctant to acknowledge it, because he had mistaken her silence for permanence. He had believed she would always remain the gentle, patient presence in the background of his life, that she would never change, never waver, never seek what he refused to give. A naive assumption, he realized with a flicker of shame, perhaps even a cruel one. He recalled their early days of marriage, how she had tried to draw him into conversation at breakfast, how she had reached for his arm during evening walks, how she had left small handwritten notes on his desk, reminding him of events, or simply wishing him a pleasant day. He had ignored nearly all of it, not out of malice, but because acknowledging her attempts felt dangerously close to opening doors he had sworn to keep closed. He had given her a house, a title, financial security, respectability in society. Was that not enough? Did marriage require intimacy, vulnerability, dependence? He had dismissed such notions as sentimental weaknesses, but tonight, as he stood alone in the dim gallery, while laughter drifted from the ballroom, he understood how profoundly he had underestimated her capacity for change and his own. For years she had lived alongside him without truly living with him, and now she seemed transformed, more confident, more serene, as though she had built a life in the spaces he left empty. He was the one who had withdrawn, and she inevitably had learned to flourish without him. A faint ache flickered beneath his ribs, unexpected, unwelcome, undeniably real. He turned away from the window and began walking back toward the ballroom, his expression carefully disciplined though his mind churned with unfamiliar agitation. As he approached the double doors, he slowed his pace. Through the narrow crack between them, he could see her again, Eleanor moving with effortless grace as she guided her guests with polite warmth. The gentleman she had spoken with earlier now stood at her side, offering her a glass of champagne. She accepted it with a smile that tightened something in Adrian's throat. He lingered outside the door longer than decorum permitted. He told himself he was deciding whether to join the gathering or return to solitude, but the truth was more complicated. He was trying to understand the strange, disquieting sensation that clutched at him every time he saw her smile at another man. He was trying to place it. It felt like the echo of an old wound, the kind that reopened not because someone struck it, but because he had never allowed it to heal properly. The betrayal of Charlotte had carved something permanent into him, something sharp that made him flinch at the mere sight of affection directed elsewhere. And now watching Eleanor, his wife, offer warmth to a stranger, it stirred that same instinctive recoil, that same bitter memory of standing alone while someone he trusted offered laughter to another. But this time the wound was not merely reopening, it was reflecting something painful back at him, the truth that he, not she, had created the distance between them. He had built a marriage of two separate lives and expected her to accept it in silence. He had asked nothing of her heart, yet assumed it remained untouched, preserved for him despite his neglect. He had believed she would remain loyal to the idea of him rather than the reality. He had been impossibly arrogant. He straightened, drawing in a slow breath as the doors swung open from the inside. Two guests stepped out, laughing softly as they passed him, unaware of the turmoil rooted beneath his composed exterior. Adrian inclined his head politely, then glanced once more toward the open doorway. Eleanor was no longer beside the gentleman. She was crossing the ballroom alone now, her expression serene, her posture elegant as always. But there was a certainty in her steps, a quiet strength he had not noticed before. She greeted a group of ladies with warm familiarity, accepted compliments on the evening, and moved with the authority of a woman who had earned respect in her own right, not because she bore his name, but because she commanded her space with gentle, undeniable influence. He watched her as though seeing her for the first time. A thought occurred to him, uncomfortable, foreign, and yet impossible to dismiss. He had married her because she felt safe, and now she felt like something he could actually lose. As he lingered at the threshold, the old wound in him throbbed, reminding him of betrayals past, of love abandoned, of trust that once shattered could never be fully restored. But beneath that familiar ache, deeper and far more dangerous, was something new. The first involuntary flicker of desire, not for possession, not for control, for her, for the woman he had ignored for 7 years, and before he could suppress it, another truth rose quietly inside him. He wanted, no, needed, to know whether he still had a place in her life. Because for the first time in as long as he could remember, the Marquis of Ravenshire felt something break through the armor he had worn for half a lifetime. He felt fear, not fear of scandal or reputation or society's expectations, fear of the possibility that he might already be too late. The night advanced with a polished elegance that should have pleased him, yet Adrian felt an unfamiliar tension binding itself around his chest the moment he stepped back into the ballroom. The music had shifted to a more spirited waltz, and couples glided across the floor with practiced grace. Candlelight shimmered across the polished marble, catching on jewels, silk, satin, and the fleeting expressions of delight that belonged to people who moved easily through society's pleasures. But Adrian was not one of them. Not tonight, perhaps not ever. He walked along the perimeter of the room with his hands behind his back, every muscle composed, each expression restrained. Yet something unbound and sharp stirred beneath the surface of his calm. He scarcely noticed the conversations that greeted him with polite nods. His attention remained fixed, relentlessly, unwillingly, on Eleanor. She was standing near the far end of the ballroom, speaking with 2 of the neighboring ladies while that same unfamiliar gentleman remained at her side. The sight of him, tall, well-groomed, confident, felt like a stone settling inside Adrian's chest. There was nothing blatantly improper in the gentleman's behavior. His posture was respectful, his tone polite. Yet Adrian's instincts recoiled all the same. The man had arrived in his home, in his ballroom, wearing the easy smile of someone unburdened by fear or expectation. A man with nothing to lose and everything to gain. Adrian approached a group of guests only to appear sociable, not because he had any intention of joining their conversation. Words drifted past him, mentions of the harvest, London politics, an upcoming wedding, but none of it made an impression. He kept his expression neutral, though every few moments his gaze, and only his, returned to Eleanor. She laughed again at something the gentleman said. He watched her lips curve, her eyes brighten, her posture relax in a way he had rarely seen in his presence. His fingers curled slightly behind his back. The sensation was unfamiliar, tight, pressing, almost primal. He did not recognize himself in moments like this. He had been trained to detach, to observe without being observed, to remain above emotional disturbances. And yet, watching Eleanor now, he felt the unmistakable stirrings of agitation. He could not look away. He moved closer without meaning to. His steps were controlled, deliberate, but there was an urgency beneath them he had not known in years. He positioned himself near the refreshment table, an appropriate distance from her group, close enough to hear fragments of their conversation, yet far enough to maintain propriety. That was when he finally heard the rival's name. Lord Harrington, Eleanor said, with an elegant inclination of her head as she accepted a glass of champagne from him. Harrington. Adrian sifted through his memory. The name was vaguely familiar, a distant cousin of the Montgomery family if he recalled correctly. Known for travel, not for roots, for charm, not commitment. A man who flitted through estates and gatherings with the air of someone who had mastered the art of being welcomed everywhere without belonging anywhere. Adrian's jaw tightened, though his expression remained civil. He observed Harrington as one would observe an opponent across a dueling field. Harrington's confidence was subtle, unforced. His posture suggested ease, his gaze carried warmth, and his presence radiated the kind of social dexterity Adrian had never cared to cultivate. What unsettled him most, however, was that Eleanor seemed perfectly comfortable in his company. She did not appear cautious or distant or hesitant. She moved with the serenity of a woman who no longer feared being invisible. Adrian told himself he should turn away. That jealousy, if that was indeed the strange turbulence tightening inside him, was unworthy of a man, of his status and discipline. But he did not move. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, his gaze fixed on her with a subtle intensity few would dare interpret. Harrington leaned closer, speaking softly. Eleanor listened with an expression that bordered on amused interest. A slow burn settled beneath Adrian's ribs. He stepped forward. "Good evening," he said to the group, his voice calm, yet carrying an unmistakable authority. The small circle of guests turned toward him at once. Eleanor's breath caught the smallest bit, not enough for outsiders to notice, but more than enough for him to see. "My lord," she murmured politely, her voice carefully controlled, "I did not expect you to join us." He held her gaze for a moment longer than etiquette allowed. "It would seem I required a reprieve from work," he replied, offering a faint nod. Harrington bowed with a courteous smile. "Marquis Ravenshire, an honor." "Lord Harrington," Adrian acknowledged, returning the gesture with perfect aristocratic composure. But beneath the facade, something was coiling tighter, sharpened by the sight of Harrington standing so close to Eleanor. The group exchanged pleasantries, though Adrian contributed little. He listened instead, listened to Harrington's elegant phrasing, his easy humor, the way he included Eleanor naturally in every sentence. Adrian's mind dissected each detail with the precision of a man accustomed to strategy. At one point, Harrington remarked, "Lady Ashcombe has orchestrated a spectacular evening. I must confess I had nearly forgotten how enchanting a well-hosted country gathering can be." Eleanor lowered her gaze modestly. "You are kind to say so. I only wish to create something pleasant for our neighbors." "Our neighbors," Harrington repeated with a slight glance toward Adrian. "Your lady appears to have extraordinary talent, my lord. The event has her touch in every corner." Adrian felt the weight of Harrington's subtle insinuation. Not aggressive, not disrespectful, but gently, dangerously familiar. He lifted his chin. "Lady Ashcombe has always managed our household with exceptional skill." Eleanor stiffened almost imperceptibly. She was not accustomed to hearing him speak well of her, not in public, not in private. Her surprise flickered across her expression before she masked it with a polite smile. Harrington looked between them with curious interest, as though he sensed threads of tension weaving themselves into the air. The ladies soon excused themselves, leaving Adrian, Eleanor, and Harrington in a small tense triangle. Harrington shifted his posture, perhaps preparing to speak again, but Eleanor turned to Adrian first. "My lord," she said quietly, "you must be weary. I did not wish to disturb your evening." "You did not disturb me," he replied, his voice lower than he intended. "Your gathering is well executed." Her eyes softened with gratitude that bordered on disbelief. "Thank you," Harrington observed them, with thoughtful silence. Adrian disliked the expression on his face, an understanding one only gained when reading between the lines of a marriage. "I should retrieve refreshments," Eleanor said, an excuse spoken before either man could respond. She moved gracefully toward the other end of the ballroom. Harrington waited until she was out of earshot, before turning to Adrian with a faint smile. "Lady Ashcombe is remarkable," he said. "You must be proud." Proud. The word struck Adrian with strange force. "I am," he replied, though the tone carried more weight than warmth. Harrington studied him for a moment. "Forgive me if I speak freely, but I had the impression, perhaps wrongly, that you do not often attend gatherings hosted by your lady." Adrian's gaze sharpened. "Your impression is irrelevant." "Ah?" Harrington murmured, "but impressions are the currency of society, my lord." There was no malice in his voice, only gentle observation. Yet it stung. Harrington inclined his head. "Allow me to be direct. Lady Ashcombe is admired this evening. If I may say so, she appears renewed." Adrian felt the words like a slow twist beneath the ribs. Harrington continued quietly, "It is rare to see a woman carry such quiet elegance and not be recognized for it." The implication was clear. He had not recognized her. Not fully, not deeply, not in the way another man might. Before Adrian could respond, Eleanor returned with a tray of refreshments. Harrington offered her a warm smile and accepted. "A glass." Adrian noticed how gently she avoided looking directly at him, as though proximity to her husband now required caution. It unsettled him more than Harrington's presence. "Would you care to dance, Lady Ashcombe?" Harrington asked. Adrian felt his breath stop. Eleanor hesitated for only a fraction of a second, so slight most would miss it, but Adrian saw it. His eyes fixed on her, waiting for her refusal. But she did not refuse. She simply offered a polite smile. "Of course, my lord." Adrian's jaw clenched. His heartbeat pulsed at his temples. He watched as Harrington extended his hand. Eleanor placed hers in his gently, her gaze steady. They walked toward the center of the ballroom as the orchestra began another waltz. Soft, graceful, intimate. Adrian's throat tightened as he watched Harrington take Eleanor into his arms. A respectful hold, yes, but one that belonged to a dance he himself had never shared with her. Harrington guided her with practiced ease. Eleanor followed, effortlessly. Their movements were synchronized, harmonious, visually perfect. Adrian tried to look away. He could not. Every turn, every step, every soft laugh she offered tasted like betrayal, but not hers, his. He had left her alone for years. He had dismissed her presence, neglected her affection. Now he stood at the edge of the ballroom watching another man hold her, knowing he had forfeited the right to feel injured. And yet injury was exactly what pressed against his ribs, like a slow, suffocating force. A servant passed him, offering champagne. Adrian took the glass merely to have something in his hand, though he did not drink from it. His gaze remained fixed on Eleanor. She looked radiant under the chandeliers, not because of Harrington, but because she had learned to shine alone. The realization hit him with the cold precision of truth. She had survived without him. Perhaps she had even flourished. Harrington spun her gently, and the guests around them murmured in admiration. Adrian felt a jolt of something dangerously close to possessiveness rise in his chest. She was his wife, his marchioness, the woman who had waited years for the smallest gesture of affection from him, and received none. Now she danced with a man who saw her, a man who valued her smile, a man who had not yet broken her heart. The waltz ended. Harrington bowed. Eleanor curtsied. They exchanged soft words Adrian could not hear. Harrington lifted her hand to his lips, not in impropriety, but in elegant gratitude. It was enough, more than enough, to ignite something fierce inside Adrian's carefully maintained composure. He stepped forward at the exact moment Eleanor turned, their gazes meeting across the ballroom. He expected her to look startled. Instead, she looked unreadable. No anger, no longing, no hurt, just distance. Distance he had created, and now could barely endure. The moment their eyes met across the ballroom, the atmosphere around Adrian shifted with a weight he could neither ignore nor fully comprehend. He had expected, perhaps even prepared himself for Eleanor to look away first. That had been the rhythm of their marriage. She made herself small, he pretended not to see her, and the distance between them widened in polite, silent increments. But tonight, nothing followed the familiar pattern. She looked at him directly, steadily, with a composure that unsettled him more than any anger could have. It was not defiance in her gaze, it was clarity, a calm, certainty he had never witnessed in her before. And he, a man known for unwavering poise, felt something fracture beneath his ribs. He moved toward her without consciously deciding to do so. His steps cut through the edges of the gathering, drawing subtle attention from several guests who knew him well enough to recognize that Lord Ravenshire did not usually cross a ballroom with purpose. Not for anyone, not even for his wife. Eleanor noticed his approach. She straightened slightly, her expression still civil, but the warmth that had once filled her eyes when he entered a room was nowhere to be found. Harrington, standing beside her after the dance, turned politely as Adrian reached them. "Lord Ravenshire," Harrington greeted with a courteous bow. "Your wife is a most enchanting partner on the floor. I commend your fortune." Adrian ignored the compliment. Or perhaps he was incapable of accepting it. His gaze remained on Eleanor, searching for something. He was not even sure. "What?" "Lady Ashcombe," he said quietly, his voice carefully modulated, though tension threaded through every syllable. "May I have a word with you?" Eleanor inhaled slowly. Not sharply, not nervously, just enough to gather herself. "Of course, my lord." Harrington smiled faintly. "I shall leave you both to your conversation." He offered Eleanor a polite nod. "Thank you for the dance." She inclined her head. "It was my pleasure." Adrian's jaw tightened at the words, though he did not know if she meant to provoke him or was simply being gracious. As Harrington disappeared into the crowd, Adrian found himself alone with his wife for the first time in hours, perhaps days, perhaps longer. The noise of the ballroom seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the tremor of unspoken truths between them. "I would speak with you privately," he murmured. She hesitated. That alone was a small wound he had not anticipated. Eleanor had always followed him without question, as though she belonged, wherever he summoned her. But tonight, she paused. "Very well," she said softly, and allowed him to lead her toward the side of the ballroom, where tall French doors opened to the dark terrace beyond. The night air was cool, carrying faint traces of rain. Lanterns flickered under the awning, casting soft light across the stone railing. Eleanor stepped away from him, giving them a proper distance, but her poise remained unbroken. Adrian closed the doors behind them, the muffled sounds of the ball, sealing off the rest of the world. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, he said, "You seem to enjoy the dance." A harmless statement. It could have been neutral, conversational, but the weight in his tone transformed it into something closer to accusation. Eleanor did not flinch. "I did." Adrian's throat tightened. "Harrington appears to be fond of your company." "He is a guest, my lord," she replied calmly. "I treated him with courtesy." It seemed more than courtesy. Her breath released, in a quiet sigh, but not one of guilt, one of resignation. "You requested honesty then? Very well. I enjoyed speaking with him. He was attentive, respectful, and he made an effort to acknowledge my presence." Her gaze lifted to his, steady and impossibly composed. "Something you have not done in years." Adrian felt the words like a direct blow, though she delivered them without cruelty. Simply truth. He stepped closer, instinctively, though she did not retreat. "You are my wife," he said, his voice low. "Your presence hardly needs acknowledgement." "Does it not?" she asked, not raising her voice but allowing the hurt, long buried, patient, suffocated, to bleed into her words. "Because there have been nights I wondered if you even remembered I existed under your roof." He stiffened, pride pricking like thorns beneath his skin. "Eleanor, do not," she interrupted gently, "pretend you have not noticed. Or worse, pretend you believe I should accept it as something natural." He had no response, none that would not sound inadequate. The silence stretched, charged and fragile. Eleanor exhaled softly. "I know the nature of our marriage, my lord. I understood it long ago. You needed a marchioness, a respectable wife to stand beside you. I accepted that. I tried to make it my duty. But affection, connection, companionship, I never expected you to provide these things." He frowned, the movement small but sincere. "Then what troubles you?" Her eyes glistened, not with tears, but with clarity sharpened by years of restraint. "What troubles me, Adrian, is that you seem disturbed now only because another man noticed me." The words struck him harder than he anticipated. She continued, each sentence a quiet unraveling of truth he had never asked to hear. "You do not want my affection. You do not desire my company. You do not share your thoughts, your burdens, your joys with me. I am invisible to you, until someone else sees me." The lantern light flickered across her face, highlighting every nuance of her expression. Strength, sadness, a hint of resolve. Adrian felt something inside him twist painfully. "Eleanor, your behavior tonight was unexpected." "My behavior?" she repeated with a faint, incredulous breath. "Speaking with a guest? Dancing when asked? Smiling in my own home?" She stepped slightly closer, not in confrontation, but in weary honesty. "If that unsettles you, my lord, then perhaps the fault is not in my behavior." His pride, his oldest companion, his sharpest shield, rose within him like a reflex. "You have always conducted yourself with reserved propriety. Tonight, you were—" He faltered, because he did not wish to accuse her of impropriety, not when she had done nothing wrong. "Different." Her expression softened, but not with affection, rather with understanding of a truth he had never voiced. "People change, Adrian." She let the words linger. "Even those who are never noticed." His breath tightened. "You were always noticed. Not by you." The simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any accusation. Frustration pushed into his voice. "Eleanor, I am not a man prone to emotional displays." "I know," she replied gently, "and I never misled you about the nature of our union. I know that as well. Then what is it you expect of me?" Her silence held more meaning than any speech she might have given. Finally, she said quietly, "Nothing. Not anymore." Something inside him splintered at that. The words should have felt like freedom. After all, he had given her so little for so long, but instead they echoed like a door closing somewhere deep within him. He took a half step forward. "Eleanor." "My lord," she interrupted softly, her tone polite but firm. "There is nothing to confront, nothing to mend. I accepted long ago that you do not wish for a marriage of closeness. I do not reproach you for it. But tonight you seemed upset, and I will not allow myself to feel responsible for your discomfort." She turned toward the doors, as though preparing to re-enter the ballroom. But he could not let her leave. Not like this. Not with the conversation unfinished and the wound between them open. He caught her wrist, not harshly, not possessively, but in a moment of impulse he had no time to suppress. She froze. The lantern light illuminated the delicate bones of her hand within his grip. He stared at their joined hands, at the reality of touching her after so many years of avoiding her warmth. His voice, when it emerged, was softer than he intended. "You are my wife." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "And you did not care about that until tonight." He felt the truth of it like a knife. "I have always respected—" "Respect is not the same as care," she said quietly. He released her wrist slowly, the loss of contact colder than the night air. Before he could speak again, the doors opened unexpectedly. One of the housemaids stepped outside, startled to find them so close. "Forgive me, my lady," she stammered. "The musicians are requesting your instruction for the next piece." Eleanor inclined her head. "I shall attend to it." Adrian found himself staring at her as she turned to leave. She paused only once, just before crossing the threshold. "My lord," she said softly without looking back, "please do not read more into tonight than there is. I am simply hosting a gathering. Nothing more." But he heard the unspoken meaning clearly. Nothing more. Nothing for you. Nothing left. The doors closed behind her, shutting him out of the warmth and light, leaving him alone on the terrace with the truth pressing hard against his lungs. He had not lost her affection tonight. He had lost it long ago. Tonight, he simply noticed. And the realization struck him with such force that he felt breathless, like a man standing on the edge of something he never intended to confront. He had broken something precious, and perhaps it could not be mended. The following morning dawned with a clarity that felt almost cruel. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Ravenshire Hall, illuminating the corridors with a brightness wholly at odds with the heaviness in Adrian's chest. Servants moved quietly through the house, clearing the remnants of the previous night's gathering. Flower petals, empty glasses, forgotten gloves, the faint scent of perfume lingering in the air. The sound of sweeping bristles and clinking porcelain echoed faintly, but none of it reached him in any significant way. Adrian stood at the top of the staircase, observing the activity below with a detachment that bordered on numbness. The events of the night replayed in his mind with relentless insistence. Eleanor dancing with Harrington, her calm defiance on the terrace, the quiet devastation in her voice when she said she no longer expected anything from him. He had slept poorly, if at all. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the distance in hers. Distance he had carved himself. He descended the stairs slowly, his footsteps measured, his posture impeccably composed. Yet inside he felt something unsteady, an unfamiliar hollowness that gnawed at him with a steady, relentless ache. In the morning room, he found Eleanor seated at the writing desk, her back straight, her hair neatly pinned. She was focused on correspondence, sorting invitations and thank you notes with gentle precision. A vase of fresh lilies sat nearby, their fragrance filling the room. She did not look up when he entered. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her with a strange mixture of longing and regret. He could not remember the last time he had entered a room simply to look at her. The realization struck him with fresh sting. "Good morning," he said quietly. She paused her writing, lifting her gaze to him with a polite calm he could not decipher. "Good morning, my lord." Not Adrian, not even a softened version of his title. Just my lord. Pleasant, proper, distant. He felt the shift in her. Said hone like a cold draught seeping into a warm room. "You rise early," he said, grasping for something to say. "I wish to tend to the correspondence before our guests depart," she replied, returning her attention to the letter before her. He hesitated. "Eleanor, about last night." Her hand paused in the slightest fraction over the paper. "Last night does not require discussion." "It does," he insisted, more urgently than he intended. She set down her pen with deliberate softness. "My lord, I meant what I said. There is nothing to confront, nothing to correct, nothing to repair." He stepped further into the room, his voice lowering. "Do not dismiss this so easily." "This?" she repeated, her tone mild but edged with resignation. "This is nothing more than consequence. You need not concern yourself." Her words settled like a weight on his chest. Before he could respond, a footman appeared at the doorway. "My lady, the carriage is ready." Adrian turned to him, confused. "Carriage?" Eleanor stood gracefully. "I am accompanying Lady Weatherby back to town. She asked for company during the journey and I agreed." Note by note, stone by stone, the truth formed itself. She was leaving, not permanently, at least she had not said so, but the act of leaving at all was a fracture in the silent pattern of their marriage. "How long will you be gone?" he asked carefully. "A week," she replied, smoothing her gloves. "Possibly longer. There are charitable matters in London I should like to." "Address?" She met his gaze without flinching. "And perhaps time will do us both good." Something twisted sharply inside him. "You did not consult me," he said, aware of how stiff the words sounded. Her expression did not change. "You have never asked to be consulted." He had no answer. The emptiness between them said everything. She retrieved a small traveling cloak from the back of the chair. "If you will excuse me, my lord." He followed her into the corridor, his composure cracking at the edges. "Eleanor." She stopped, turning toward him with quiet patience. A dozen emotions rose in his throat, but none formed into words that felt safe to speak. He had never learned how to express desire, regret, longing. Those were foreign languages to him. When he finally found his voice, it emerged softer than intended. "Must you go?" Her eyes softened, not with affection, but with sorrow. "I must." "Because of Harrington?" he asked, unable to contain the question. She looked almost surprised. "No, Adrian, because of us." His breath froze. "I need space," she continued. "You need clarity, and neither can exist while we stand in the same rooms pretending there is nothing broken." He felt the sting of those words more keenly than she realized. Eleanor exhaled softly. "This is not anger, it is simply acceptance." Acceptance. The word felt like a blade drawn slowly across old wounds. Just then, Lady Weatherby called from the foyer, and Eleanor inclined her head respectfully. She moved past him, her skirts brushing lightly against his leg. It was the first physical contact between them in months, perhaps longer, and it startled him with its unexpected intimacy. He watched her descend the stairs, watched her exchange polite farewells with the staff, watched her step into the light morning air. He remained rooted to the top of the staircase as the carriage door closed behind her and the horses trotted forward. He stayed there until the carriage disappeared from view. Only then did he exhale, a long, hollow breath that carried more weight than he wished to acknowledge. The next days passed with a heaviness that clung to every corner of Ravenshire Hall. Without Eleanor's presence, her calm steps in the corridors, her soft voice speaking with the butler, the delicate way she arranged flowers or left windows slightly open, the house felt cavernous, silent, strangely cold. Adrian found himself wandering through rooms he had not visited in years. The conservatory, where plants she tended had begun to wilt in her absence. The library, where a shawl she once left behind still rested neatly folded over a chair. The music room, where her sheet music lay untouched. He touched nothing. He changed nothing. But he felt everything. He spent most evenings in the study, sitting at the desk where her early letters had once lain unread. He opened one now, not because he wished to torment himself, but because he no longer wished to hide from truth. Her handwriting was delicate but firm. The words simple, earnest, now painful. "I hope your day is peaceful, my lord. If you wish, we might walk the grounds this evening. The roses are beginning to bloom." He had never replied, never walked with her, never allowed a single rose to be shared. He closed the letter with a slow, shuddering exhale. He had thought himself immune to regret. He was not. A week later, unable to bear the silence any longer, Adrian travelled to London. He told the staff he had business at the House of Lords. He told himself it was practical, necessary, sensible. But as his carriage rolled through the crowded streets of London, past hansom cabs, vendors, and the familiar rhythm of city life, he knew the truth. He had come for her. The rain began again, a persistent drizzle tapping against the carriage windows. The city's bustle continued uninterrupted, yet within him everything slowed. He felt the strangeness of this pursuit, of stepping into her world rather than expecting her to inhabit his. He arrived at Lady Weatherby's townhouse shortly after dusk. Lanterns glowed from the windows, soft laughter floated from somewhere inside. He dismounted, straightened his coat, and approached the door with a mixture of resolve and hesitation. When the butler opened it, he bowed. "My Lord Ravenshire, Lady Weatherby is hosting a dinner. Shall I announce you?" Adrian swallowed. "Lady Ashcombe, my wife. Is she here?" The butler nodded. "She is." He stepped aside, allowing Adrian in. Adrian crossed the threshold, bracing himself, but nothing prepared him for the sight that met him. Eleanor was standing at the far end of the drawing room, surrounded by a small circle of guests, engaged in gentle conversation, poised as though she belonged entirely to this new environment. She wore a gown of late evening blue, her hair arranged elegantly, her expression serene. She looked content without him. A strange, piercing ache formed inside him, the same ache he had felt when he first saw her smile at Harrington, only now it was sharper, louder, undeniable. He took a step forward, then stopped, because at that exact moment she lifted her gaze and saw him, and for the first time in their entire marriage, she did not look surprised, she did not look relieved, she did not look expectant. She looked unreadable, as though she had already accepted a future that no longer depended on him. Something inside Adrian collapsed silently, and the truth fell upon him with brutal clarity. He had not come to London to bring her home. He had come because he feared she no longer wished to return. For several seconds after Eleanor's gaze met his across Lady Weatherby's drawing room, Adrian remained completely still, as though his body refused to obey even the simplest command. The soft murmur of conversation, the tinkling of crystal glasses, the warmth of the candlelit chandeliers, none of it reached him. All he saw was her, and all he felt was the cold truth that she no longer belonged to the quiet image he had kept of her, a woman waiting at the edges of his life. She was no longer waiting. A polite smile passed across her lips as she returned her attention to the guests around her. It was not dismissive, it was not unkind, but it held no invitation for him either. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Lady Weatherby approached, greeting Adrian with exaggerated enthusiasm. "My dear Marquess, what an unexpected delight. Do come in, do come in. You must allow Eleanor to finish speaking with the Wycliffes, but she will be most pleased to see you." The lie was gentle and well-intentioned, but it slid like ice beneath his ribs. "She will be pleased to see you." No, Eleanor had not shown pleasure, surprise, or even the faintest spark of longing. Only composure, only distance. Adrian inclined his head in thanks and followed Lady Weatherby into the room, though it felt as though every step required conscious effort. He positioned himself near the fireplace, close enough to watch. Eleanor far enough to avoid interrupting her. He could not recall the last time he had been the one to wait for her. It felt strangely humbling. He watched the subtle shift of her posture, the measured grace of her gestures, the soft intelligence in her expression. She spoke with quiet confidence, replying thoughtfully to Lord Wycliffe's commentary on a recent parliamentary proposal. She was not flustered. She did not falter. There was no trace of the timid bride he remembered. She had become a woman entirely comfortable in her own presence. When had that happened? How much had he failed to see? Finally, after several minutes, she excused herself from the group, walking toward the far table where teacups had been arranged. Adrian followed her with his gaze, unable to look away even for an instant. He forced himself to approach slowly, not like a husband reclaiming his place, but like a man stepping into uncertain terrain. "Eleanor," he said quietly when he reached her side. She looked at him then, properly, directly, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, but whatever it was, she concealed it with practiced discipline. "My Lord Ravenshire," she replied, her tone even. "I had not expected you in London. I came to see you." A subtle breath escaped her, neither warm nor cold, simply controlled. "Is everything well at Ravenshire Hall?" His jaw tightened. She asked out of duty, not concern, and the realization stung more than he wished to admit. "The estate is fine," he replied. "It is I who—" He hesitated. Words of vulnerability were foreign to him, heavy, unfamiliar, difficult to shape. "I wish to speak with you." She folded her hands neatly in front of her. "We may speak, but I am hosting at the moment. Perhaps after dinner." The politeness of it, measured, impersonal, felt like a door quietly closing. "Eleanor, please," he murmured, lowering his voice so no one else might overhear. "I would speak now." She looked up at him again, and this time her gaze held something sharper. Not anger, no, Eleanor did not glare, but there was firmness in her eyes, boundaries, strength. "My lord," she said gently, "I will not abandon my guests." He swallowed hard. "Very well." It was rejection, elegantly delivered. Hours later, after the dinner had concluded and guests were beginning to disperse, Adrian found her in the candle-lit corridor near the library. She was speaking softly to Lady Weatherby, thanking her for her hospitality. When she turned and saw him waiting, she paused. "May we speak now?" he asked quietly. Lady Weatherby excused herself with the enthusiasm of someone who adored drama, but knew better than to linger near it. Eleanor stood perfectly still when Adrian approached her. "I did not intend to intrude tonight," he said. "I came because your absence has been difficult." Her breath caught the smallest bit, almost imperceptible, but she did not allow the emotion to settle. "I left to find clarity, not to cause you discomfort." "I am not asking you to return out of obligation," he continued. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with a care he rarely used. "I am asking to understand the distance between us." She inhaled deeply, then exhaled with a steadiness that sent a faint ache through him. "The distance between us was created long before I left Ravenshire Hall. This week has simply shown me how wide it has become." He stepped closer. "I am trying—" "No," she said gently. "You are reacting. There is a difference." He froze. Eleanor's gaze softened only slightly. "You acted because Lord Harrington noticed me, because you feared something. But fear is not the same thing as affection." The words cut him cleanly, quietly. He swallowed. "I am not accustomed to this," he struggled. "I am not accustomed to revealing myself." "I know," she replied. "I learned that early in our marriage." He felt the air tighten around them. "But I also learned," she continued slowly, "that one cannot spend years starving a bond and expect it to remain intact." Her voice was calm, controlled, terrifyingly honest. Adrian looked away for the briefest moment. Pride had been his armor for so long that lowering it now felt like stepping onto open ground. But facing her required courage he had not known he possessed. "I have been unkind," he forced out, "neglectful, distant. I see that now." Eleanor's expression shifted, softening, but not yielding. "I never asked for grand declarations, only for presence. A shared meal. A genuine question, a conversation." She smiled faintly. "Such small things, yet impossible to you." He flinched at her accuracy. She clasped her hands lightly before her. "You are speaking now because you fear what you might lose. But I do not know if you truly wish to build something new, or if you simply cannot bear change." He stepped forward, his voice low. "I wish to build something with you." She blinked, stunned by the sincerity she heard, perhaps for the first time in their marriage. But years of disappointment had hardened her. "My lord," she whispered, "you cannot erase years with a single night of worry." "I do not wish to erase the past," he answered. only to change the future. She closed her eyes for a moment, as though steadying herself. When she opened them again, there was sadness in her gaze. "Adrian," she said softly, using his name without formality, for the first time in years, "I do not know if I have anything left to give you." His breath left him sharply. Her voice remained calm but carried the full weight of truth. "I burned quietly beside you for years. I hoped. I waited. I reached for you until I could no longer bear the silence. Something in me broke, and I learned to stop reaching." He felt the words like a physical wound. "I am not refusing reconciliation," she said gently, "but I cannot return to Ravenshire until I know you seek me, and not simply the role I occupy." "I am seeking you," he replied, the words raw but honest. "Do you not believe me?" "I believe you want to," she answered, "but wanting is not the same as choosing." Silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating, intimate. When she finally spoke again, her voice trembled the slightest bit. "Give me time. Time." The one thing he had always taken for granted. "How long?" he asked softly. She lowered her gaze. "I do not know." He reached for her hand but stopped himself. He had no right, not yet, to touch her. "Eleanor," he whispered, "I am not the man you think me incapable of becoming." She lifted her eyes to his. "Then become him." He felt the words land with quiet force. Before he could respond, footsteps echoed down the corridor, other guests preparing to depart. Eleanor stepped back, restoring the distance between them. "Good night, my lord," she said with gentle finality. Not cold, not cruel, just final. She turned and walked away, disappearing into the soft glow of the drawing room. He watched her go, unable to follow, unable to speak. For the first time in his life, the Marquis of Ravenshire understood what it meant to stand powerless. Tonight he had not been dismissed. He had been measured and found wanting. He exhaled shakily, pressing a hand to the wall to steady himself. The realization was mercilessly clear. To win her back, he would have to do something he had never done. He would have to change, not in words, not in promises, but in action. And the man he would need to become, he had no idea if he had the strength to become him. But he knew one thing with certainty. He could no longer bear a life in which she looked at him with nothing but distance. Tomorrow he would return to Ravenshire Hall, and he would begin. He would become a man worthy of calling her his wife, even if she never returned. The journey back to Ravenshire Hall was a blur of rain, grey skies, and unspoken vows settling heavily in Adrian's chest. He had left London with the quiet dignity expected of a marquis, but the moment the city vanished behind the rolling countryside, the facade dissolved, and what remained was a man carrying a weight he had never learned to hold. For days after returning home, he threw himself into actions, not declarations, not letters, not words that would have felt hollow even to him. Actions. Small things at first. He joined the steward in the morning rounds, asked the gardeners about Eleanor's roses, visited the charity accounts she used to review herself. He walked through the grounds she once longed for him to walk with her, memorizing the paths she took, the small bridges she favored, the bench overlooking the stream where she would sometimes sit alone. Every step reminded him of how absent he had been, how many opportunities he had allowed to vanish without a second thought. The staff noticed the change, subtle, cautious glances following him as he passed, but no one asked. Adrian had always been a man of reserved composure. Now he was a man of quiet resolve, and though they sensed the difference, they respected the silence around it. Yet as days turned into a week, and Eleanor still did not return, that resolve began to feel more like a tightening around his lungs. Every letter that arrived from London, every carriage that approached the estate, every soft footstep in the corridor was enough to make his breath pause. Each time it was not her. He had not known loneliness before. Not truly. Solitude, yes. But solitude was chosen. This was the consequence of choices, made too late. On the 10th day, a letter finally arrived. He recognized her handwriting the moment the footman placed it on the silver tray. For a brief second, his heart lifted with a fierce hope. Then he hesitated, afraid that whatever words lay inside might end something he had only just begun to understand. He opened it slowly. "I will return to Ravenshire Hall within the week. We may speak then. No affection, no tenderness, but not rejection either." It was enough. Eleanor arrived on a soft evening of late autumn, when the sky burned faintly with the last gold of sunset, and the air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter. Adrian stood in the entrance hall, waiting, not as a husband claiming his right, but as a man uncertain whether he still had one. When she stepped through the door, he felt his breath catch. She wore a traveling cloak the color of deep wine, her hair pinned neatly, her expression composed. Her beauty was quiet, but it struck him with a force he had no defense against. She removed her gloves slowly, thanking the footman. She had not yet looked at him. He feared she might walk past him entirely, but then she lifted her gaze. "My lord," she said softly. He bowed his head. "Lady Ashcombe, welcome home." For a heartbeat, something flickered in her eyes, something close to pain. Then she inclined her head with polite restraint. "May we speak in the west drawing room?" He gestured for her to lead the way. The drawing room was quiet, lit only by two tall lamps near the fireplace. She entered first and moved toward the window, touching the silk curtains lightly as though grounding herself. He closed the door behind them. For a moment, neither spoke. The room felt heavy, the air charged with 7 years of silence pressing in on them. Finally, Adrian stepped closer. "Eleanor," he began, his voice low, stripped of all aristocratic armor, "I owe you more than an explanation, but I would offer it nonetheless." She clasped her hands. "I am listening." He drew in a slow breath. "I have wronged you. Consistently, quietly, thoughtlessly. I believed distance was safety, that silence was dignity, that if I stayed behind walls, I could not be wounded." Her expression softened slightly, but she did not interrupt. "I thought myself immune to longing," he continued, "and blind to the consequences of withholding what a husband owes his wife. You gave me gentleness, sincerity, and patience, and I met it with indifference." His voice grew tighter. "But the truth is, I was a coward." Eleanor's breath caught the faintest bit. Adrian stepped closer, his composure shaking for the first time. "I feared affection. I feared vulnerability. I feared you would see the flaws I have spent a lifetime concealing. And so I kept you at a distance to protect myself." The confession hovered between them, raw, earnest. Eleanor's eyes glistened. "And now?" she whispered. He swallowed. "Now I fear something far greater." She waited, the silence pulling at his chest. He stepped closer until only a few feet separated them. His voice broke against the quiet of the room. "I fear losing you." Her breath shuddered. "I fear," he continued, "that the years I spent ignoring you have cost me the right to ask anything of you now. I fear the distance I created is no longer bridgeable, and I fear," his voice shook, "that you have found peace in a world where I am not welcome." Eleanor closed her eyes, as though those words were more painful than she expected. He took another step. "But more than fear, I feel regret, deeply. Every day since you left the hall, I have felt it. It is a kind of suffering I have never known." Her lips parted gently, but no words emerged. "I am not asking for immediate forgiveness," he said. "I'm not asking for affection you no longer have. I ask only for the chance to prove, through action, not sentiment, that I can be the man you believed you were marrying." The room fell into a long, trembling silence. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "Adrian," she murmured, "I do not wish to punish you." He froze. "I never wished to," she continued softly. "I never sought to make you feel the pain I carried alone. But I needed distance. I needed to breathe somewhere. My heart was not constantly waiting for something that never came." He lowered his head. She stepped closer, carefully, as though approaching a wounded creature. "When you appeared in London, I told myself your presence was only fear, only jealousy, only reaction." She exhaled. "But I have watched you. You have changed. You move differently, you speak differently, you look at me differently." His heartbeat stumbled. Eleanor's voice grew softer. "And that frightens me, my lord." He lifted his gaze sharply. "Why?" "Because hope," she whispered, "is a dangerous thing." He felt the words cut through him with a piercing tenderness. "I do not know," she continued, her voice trembling, "whether I am capable of opening my heart again. I do not know whether the woman I was, the one who waited for you, still exists. You broke something in me. His breath faltered. "But," she continued, "something in you broke, too." He met her eyes then, truly met them. And in that moment, something shifted in the air between them. A recognition, a shared wound, a quiet surrender. He took one final step until only inches remained. "Eleanor," he murmured, "I am not asking for the woman you once were. I ask only for the woman who stands before me now." Her breath trembled. "And I offer," he said, voice raw with vulnerability he had never before allowed himself, "the man I am now, not the man I pretended to be." The room was utterly silent. She looked at him, really looked at him, searching for falsehood, for pride, for hidden walls. She found none. Slowly, with a fragility that broke him open, she lifted her hand, only halfway, as though afraid he would let it fall into air. Adrian's breath shook as he reached forward, not grasping but offering. Their fingers met, not tightly, not passionately, but with a tenderness that felt like a beginning neither had dared imagine. Eleanor's eyes glistened. "Do not hurt me again." He swallowed, his voice barely a whisper. "I would sooner wound myself." For the first time in 7 years, something warm flickered between them, small, delicate, but undeniably alive. Not forgiveness, not reunion, not yet, but hope, the most dangerous thing of all, and the most necessary.